My own children sided with the woman who destroyed our home. The truth came out 7 years later. If you have never watched a single video on this channel, let this be the one you stay for. Because what I am about to tell you is the kind of story that will make you question every person you ever trusted, every silence you ever kept, and every judgment you ever made too soon. And if this story hits you the way it has hit everyone who has heard it, and it will, hit that subscribe button, because we tell stories here that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, let us begin. Adaeze was not a complicated woman. That was the first thing anyone who knew her would tell you. She was not loud, she was not dramatic, she did not chase trouble. She was the kind of woman who woke up before the sun, tied her wrapper, and went about her day with a quiet dignity that made other women want to be like her. She cooked, she farmed, she raised her children with both hands and both eyes open. She loved her husband Chukwuemeka the way the women of her mother's village had taught her, completely, without conditions, without keeping score. And Chukwuemeka, what a man he was. At least that is what the whole of Oguta thought. He was tall in the way that made younger men stand straighter when he walked past. He had a voice that could quiet a room and a laugh that could fill one. He was a trader, palm oil mostly, and he was good at it. The kind of good that comes not just from luck, but from the kind of sharp mind that reads people before they speak. He had built a decent compound, not the biggest in the village, not the smallest. He had 3 children with Adaeze, 2 sons and a daughter, and from the outside, everything looked the way it was supposed to look. But here is the thing about things that look right from the outside. Sometimes the outside is all there is. Their first son was Obiora, 19 years old, broad-shouldered, his father's eyes, his mother's stubbornness. Then came Namdi, 17, the quieter one, the one who watched more than he spoke. And the last was Chidinma, their daughter, 14 years old and sharp as a blade. She had a tongue that could slice through nonsense and a heart that had not yet learned to hide itself. These three children will become the center of everything. Now, the woman who destroyed their home had a name. Her name was Nena. Nena arrived in Oguta the way rumors arrive, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. She came from a neighboring town claiming her husband had died and she had nowhere to go. She rented a small room near the market, set up a small provision stall, and within weeks she had made herself visible in a way that felt deliberate without looking deliberate. She was beautiful in an obvious way, the kind of beauty that doesn't need effort, that announces itself before the person does. She laughed easily. She leaned in when she talked to men. She had a way of making every man she spoke to feel like the most interesting person in the room. Adaeze noticed her. Of course she did, but she said nothing, because Adaeze was not a complicated woman, and she did not believe in creating problems that had not yet announced themselves. The problem announced itself on a Tuesday. Chukwuemeka came home late. Not unusually late. He had been coming home late for about 2 months by that point, always with explanations that were just specific enough to sound real. A delayed truck, a buyer from Owerri, a palaver at the motor park. Adaeze had filed all of these explanations in the part of her mind where a woman stores the things she is not yet ready to look at. But that Tuesday, something was different. He came in smelling of a perfume that was not hers, not faintly, strongly, the way you smell of something when you have been close enough to it to carry it home. She did not say a word that night, but the next morning, while Chukwuemeka was still asleep, Adaeze walked to the market. She walked past Nena's stall, and Nena looked at her with eyes that held something, not guilt, not shame, something closer to victory, a small private smile that lasted half a second, then disappeared. That half second changed everything. Adaeze went home and confronted her husband, quietly, the way she did everything. She did not shout, she did not throw things. She looked at him and she said very simply, "Are you sleeping with that woman near the market?" Chukwuemeka did not flinch. He did not look away. He looked straight back at her and said, "What woman? You are imagining things." And that was the beginning of the end. Over the next 4 months, the affair did not hide itself, it revealed itself in layers, like something rotting under a house. A neighbor saw them in Owerri. Another woman told Adaeze she had seen Chukwuemeka enter Nena's room at night. Nena herself started showing up at community events, dressed in Ankara that matched Chukwuemeka's outfits. The kind of thing a woman only does when she wants to be seen, when she wants the whole village to know something before the wife does. And then the cruelest thing happened. Adaeze's own children began to pull away from her. It started with Obiora. He was the firstborn, the one most like his father, and perhaps because of that, the one most susceptible to his father's version of events. One evening, Adaeze overheard Chukwuemeka talking to Obiora in a low voice in the back room. She couldn't make out all the words, but she heard enough. Your mother is unstable, she has been making accusations, she is driving me away. She stood outside that door and felt something cold move through her chest. Obiora began to look at her differently after that, with a kind of cautious pity, the way you look at someone you have been told is unwell. He stopped sitting with her in the evenings. When she tried to talk to him, his answers became short, polite but short, as if he had put up a wall made of something she could not see. Then Namdi followed. Namdi, her quieter one, her second son, who had always been the one to bring her a cup of water without being asked, who had always sat at her feet when she was tired. He began spending more time at his father's side. When Nena started visiting the compound, yes, Chukwuemeka eventually brought her openly into the compound as if daring Adaeze to say something. Namdi would sit with her, talk to her, even laugh at her jokes. Every single time Adaeze witnessed this, she felt as though someone was pressing a hot iron at the inside of her chest. Only Chidinma, her daughter, her last child, remained at her side. 14 years old with fire in her eyes and no patience for things she could see were wrong. Chidinma watched everything. She watched her brothers drift towards her father and towards Nena. She watched her mother become quieter and quieter, like a flame that someone was slowly starving of air. And Chidinma, young as she was, made a decision. She would not leave her mother's side, no matter what. Now, pay attention, because this is the part of the story where things get complicated. This is where it stops being a simple story about a cheating husband. This is where the layers begin to peel. One night, Adaeze was in her kitchen. It was late. Chidinma was sitting on a stool in the corner, pretending to do her schoolwork but actually watching her mother. Nena walked into the kitchen, not into the compound, into the kitchen, as if she lived there. She looked at Adaeze with that same small smile, and she said, "Mama Obiora, you are a stubborn woman, but even the tallest Iroko tree must fall eventually." Adaeze turned and looked at her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she said, calmly, "Get out of my kitchen." And Nena left, but she left smiling. And Chidinma from her corner watched all of it with eyes that stored every detail. 3 weeks later, something in the compound went missing. A box. A wooden box that Adaeze kept under her bed. It was not a famous box, not something anyone spoke about openly. But Adaeze knew what was in it. Documents. Land documents. Her late father's land that had been transferred to her name before she married. It was not Chukwuemeka's land. It was not the family land. It was her land, her inheritance, the one thing that had come from her own blood.
The box was gone. Adaeze turned the room upside down. She searched everywhere. When she asked Chukwuemeka, he said he had not seen it. When she asked her sons, both of them said they knew nothing about it. Chidinma swore she had not touched it. And then, a week after the box disappeared, Adaeze heard through a neighbor that Nena had been seen at the land registry office in town with a man looking at documents. Something shifted in Adaeze that day. The grief that had been pulling her under suddenly became something harder, something colder. She stopped crying. She stopped waiting. She began to think. But before she could act, Chukwuemeka made his move. He gathered the children, all 3 of them. He sat them down in the main room of the compound and he told them a story. Not a lie, exactly, the most dangerous deceptions are never pure lies. He told them a version of events that was carefully, surgically constructed to cast Adaeze as the villain. He told them that their mother had been hostile to him for years, that she had refused him things he would not name in front of children, that her behavior had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. He told them that Inenna was a good woman who had done nothing wrong, that their mother was bitter and jealous and was trying to destroy the family. And then he said the thing that broke Adaeze when she found out about it later. He told them, "If you love this family, you will support me. A man who is not supported in his own home has no home." Obiora, 19 and full of a young man's need to believe his father is right, chose his side that day. Enamdi, 17 and terrified of conflict, chose his side that day. Only Chidima stood up from that meeting, looked her father in the eye and said, "I do not believe you." She walked out. Chukwuemeka was furious. He called her back. She kept walking. And from that day, the compound was split. 2 sons on one side, 1 mother and 1 daughter on the other, and a father and a strange woman in the middle, like a fire that had been deliberately set and was now being carefully fed. Stop for a moment, because I need you to sit with this. I need you to feel what Adaeze was feeling. She had not done anything wrong. She had not been a bad wife. She had not cheated, had not lied, had not neglected her children. She had simply been in the way of what someone else wanted. And the people she had poured herself into, her sons, her firstborn, the boys she had carried in her body and raised with her bare hands, had stood on the other side of the room and looked at her like she was the problem. There is no pain like that. There is simply no pain like that. Now, here is where the story turns. Here is the first of the twists that will rearrange everything you think you know. Adaeze did not fall apart. She had looked like she was falling apart. The quietness, the withdrawal, the hollow eyes. But inside, something had calcified. She went to her sister in the next village, her sister Ngozi, who was the kind of woman who did not give comfort, she gave strategy. Ngozi sat with her for 3 days, and what happened in those 3 days, Adaeze never told anyone completely, not even Chidima. But when Adaeze came back, she was different. Not louder, not angrier, just different in a way that people around her could feel but not explain. She began asking questions, quietly, through people who owed her favors, through women in the market who had ears everywhere. She asked about Inenna. Where had she really come from? What had happened to her husband? Why had she come to Obuta specifically? And what she found was this. Inenna had not been a widow. Her husband had not died. He had left her. He had left her because she had done to him what she was now doing to Chukwuemeka's family. She had inserted herself into his life, extracted what she wanted, and moved on. A woman in Inenna's hometown said this. Another woman confirmed it, and then a third piece of information came that made Adaeze sit very still for a very long time. Inenna and Chukwuemeka had not met by accident. They had known each other before, years before, from a business deal that had gone badly. A deal in which Chukwuemeka had once cheated a man, Inenna's uncle, out of a significant sum of money. The man had never recovered from the loss. He had died bitter and poor 3 years later. Inenna had come to Oguta with a purpose. She had not come to find love. She had not come to find a home. She had come to take from Chukwuemeka the way Chukwuemeka had once taken from her family. And the most devastating part, the part that made Adaeze's hands shake when she finally understood it, was that Chukwuemeka did not know this. He genuinely thought Inenna loved him. He had walked willingly into a trap laid specifically for him, and in his blindness, he used his own wife and children as collateral. Adaeze now faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could expose everything, go to the elders in the village, show what she had found, let the whole truth come out in public, and Nena would be disgraced, Chukwuemeka would be humiliated, the family would be destroyed in a different way than it was already being destroyed, but it would be destroyed nonetheless. Or she could wait. She chose to wait, because Adaeze had noticed something that no one else had. Chidinma, her 14-year-old daughter, who had stood up from her father's meeting and walked out, had not just been watching. Chidinma had been writing. Not with a device. This was not that kind of village, not yet. Chidinma had been writing in a small notebook with a green cover that she kept hidden in the lining of her school bag. She had been writing down everything she saw. Every conversation, every date, every incident, with the obsessive, careful precision of a child who has decided that the truth matters and that someone should be keeping it. When Adaeze found this notebook, not by snooping, Chidinma showed her. She sat with her daughter and they read through it together. And Adaeze understood that her daughter had unknowingly been building a case, a record, a testimony. She held her daughter's face in both hands and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Keep writing. Do not stop." Months passed. Nena moved more boldly. She began redecorating corners of the compound, moving things, replacing things, as if erasing Adaeze's presence piece by piece. She cooked for Chukwuemeka in Adaeze's kitchen. She sat in Adaeze's spot at the evening meal. Obiora and Namdi allowed all of this because they had been told and had chosen to believe that their mother had forfeited her place by being difficult. Adaeze watched all of this. She endured it, not because she was weak, because she was waiting. And then, the land thing moved to a new level. Adaeze received a letter from the land registry. The letter stated that a title transfer had been filed on her own land, filed in her name, but not by her. Someone had forged her signature. The land was in the process of being transferred to a new owner, a business name that Adaeze had never heard of. She hired a lawyer. The lawyer cost her almost everything she had saved, but she hired one. The lawyer traced the business name. It traced back to a man in Port Harcourt, a man who, when the lawyer dug further, turned out to be Nena's cousin. There it was. Adaeze now had it all. The motive, the forgery, the connection, the history. Everything laid out like a net, and Chukwuemeka at the center of it without even knowing he was caught. She went to the elders. Now, this is the moment the whole village had been waiting for without knowing it. Adaeze had been so quiet for so long that people had begun to write her off. The women in the market had stopped speaking carefully around her, stopped softening their voices when they mentioned Nena's name. They had assumed she had accepted things, buried her pride, decided to survive quietly in the corner of her compound.
So when she walked into the elders' meeting, not alone, with her lawyer, with Chidinma carrying that green notebook, with Ngozi walking behind them like a woman going to war, the entire village stopped. You know how silence has different qualities? Some silence is peaceful, some is stunned. This was the third kind. This was the silence of people who suddenly understand that they have misjudged the situation entirely. Adaeze laid everything out. She did not shout, she did not weep. She spoke in that quiet, direct voice she had always used. The forged documents, the land fraud, Nena's history in her hometown, the connection to Chukwuemeka's old business betrayal. And finally, Chidinma stood up and read from her green notebook 2 years of recorded observations, dates, names, specific incidents, the exact words Chukwuemeka had used when he turned his sons against his mother, the exact day Nena had walked into Adaeze's kitchen and issued her threat about the Iroko tree. It took over 2 hours. When it was done, the compound was very quiet. Nena sat across the room with that small smile gone from her face for the first time since Adaeze had known her. In its place was something naked and cold.
Obiora sat down with his hands folded and his eyes on the ground. And even from across the room, you could see the moment it landed. The moment he understood that he had not been the one pulling strings, that he had been the puppet all along. But here is where the story does what good stories always do. Here is where it refuses to be simple. Because Obiora stood up. Obiora, the firstborn, the one who had chosen his father's side, who had looked at his mother with cautious pity for 2 years, he stood up in the middle of that meeting, and his voice was not steady when he spoke. He looked at his mother and he said, "Mama, I did not know. I did not know any of this." And Adaeze looked at her son, her firstborn, the boy she had carried first, the one whose first cry had remade her into a mother. She looked at him for a long time, and she said, "I know." Just those 2 words, but the way she said them, every person in that room understood that this was not a small moment. This was a woman extending mercy she had every right to withhold. Nnamdi broke next. He had been sitting very still, very pale, the way he always looked when he was processing something too large for words. When his mother said those 2 words to Obiora, Nnamdi put his face in his hands. He did not make a sound, but his shoulders shook. And Adaeze, without getting up, without crossing the room, simply said, "Nnamdi, look at me." She held his eyes. She said, "It is not your fault that a grown man used you." That was all, but it was everything. Nnenna was ordered to leave the compound, the land fraud was reported to the authorities, and her cousin in Port Harcourt was eventually prosecuted. Nnenna herself disappeared from Oguta within days, quietly, with her things packed before sunrise, gone the way she had come. The village watched her go with the particular satisfaction of people who had been complicit in something and now wanted to pretend they had seen it coming all along. Chukwuemeka was a different matter. He was not a criminal. He had been manipulated, yes, but he had also chosen to manipulate his own family. He had used his sons against his mother. He had allowed another woman into his home and had watched his wife diminish, and had felt perhaps that he deserved what Nnenna was offering. For all of this, the elders had things to say. Long things. The kind of things that strip a proud man of his pride in front of everyone he has spent his life performing for. He sat and he took it. And when the elders were done, when the room had finally emptied of everyone except the family, Chukwuemeka was left alone with Adaeze and his 3 children. What happened in that room, in that private hour, was never fully told to the village. People tried to find out. Neighbors lingered near the compound walls. Gossips invented versions. But the actual truth of what was said in that room stayed inside those 4 walls. What the village did see, and what they talked about for years, was this. The next morning, Chukwuemeka's car was packed. He left. Not permanently, or at least not immediately. He went to stay with his brother in another town. Whether this was his own decision or a condition set by Adaeze, no one knew, but he left. And Adaeze remained. She remained in the compound, in her kitchen, in her spot at the evening meal, with her 3 children around her, all 3 of them now, even the ones that had strayed, and with a quietness that was different from the quietness she had worn through all those dark months. That old quietness was the quietness of a woman being slowly extinguished. This new quietness was something else. It was the quietness of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side, and no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Now, I told you that the truth came out 7 years later, and you might be thinking, wait, haven't we just had the truth? The land fraud, the expose, the elders meeting. Isn't that the truth? No, that is only the first truth. There was a second one buried under it, and this one was the one that undid everything. 7 years after Nnenna left Oguta, Obiora was 26 years old. He had become a man in the way that men become men when they have had to reckon with something shameful about themselves. Carefully, quietly, with a humility that was not natural to him but that he had chosen. He was working in Lagos, sending money home to his mother every month, calling her every Sunday morning. He had not stopped trying to make up for those 2 years. He received a letter. Not a legal letter, a personal one, from an address in Aba he did not recognize. He opened it, expecting, he did not know what he expected. The letter was from a woman named Ifeoma. Ifeoma turned out to have been Nena's closest friend during the years Nena had spent in Oguta. She had watched everything from the sidelines. She had known about the plan, had known about the forged documents, had known about the connection to Chukwuemeka's old business betrayal. And she had stayed silent because Nena had told her things, private things, frightening things that had made silence feel safer than speaking. But now Nena was dead. She had died of an illness 2 months earlier in a hospital in Aba with no family around her. Ifeoma had been the one to sit with her at the end. And in those final days, Nena had talked, the way people do when the time for keeping secrets is over. And what Nena had said in those final days was this. She had come to Oguta to get revenge for her uncle. That was true. She had targeted Chukwuemeka deliberately. That was also true. But somewhere along the way, and Nena had told Ifeoma this with tears, the first real tears Ifeoma had ever seen from her. Somewhere along the way, something had happened that she had not planned. She had seen Adaeze. Not seen her in the way of a rival, seen her in the way of a mirror. She had watched Adaeze move through her days, the quiet dignity, the hands that never stopped working, the way she loved her children without needing them to love her back loudly. And Nena had recognized something. She had recognized the woman she herself might have become if her own life had turned out differently, if her uncle had not been ruined, if she had not grown up watching her family destroyed by someone else's greed, if bitterness had not become the only language she knew. Nena had told Ifeoma, that woman never did anything wrong. Not to me, not to anyone. I chose her because she was in the way, and I knew from the first week that she was better than me. I kept going anyway.
And then, the final thing. The thing Obiora sat with for weeks before he could bring himself to tell anyone. Nena had said, the children. Tell the children. Especially the oldest one. He has his mother's eyes, that boy. Even when he was standing against her, he had her eyes. Tell him she never lost them. Obiora read that line 4 times, 5 times. He sat in his apartment in Lagos with the letter in his hands, and the Lagos traffic loud outside his window, and the whole world going on around him, and he read that line until he could not see the words anymore. He called his mother. He did not read her the letter over the phone. He went home. He went back to Oguta for the first time in over a year, drove the whole way himself, arrived at his mother's compound in the early evening when the light was orange and low, and the smell of the compound, that specific smell of red earth and wood smoke, and the tree his mother had planted when he was born, hit him before he even got out of the car. Adaeze was in the kitchen. She looked up when he walked in. She did not look surprised. She looked the way she always looked, present, quiet, waiting to see what he had brought with him. He sat down on the kitchen stool, the same stool Chidima used to sit on to watch her mother cook, and he put the letter on the table between them. She read it without saying a word. When she finished, she folded it carefully, the way she folded everything, neatly, without wasted motion. She put it on the table. She looked at her son. She said, "You are right, you know. You do have my eyes." Obiora looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he said, and his voice, this big man's voice, broke clean in half when he said it, "Mama, I am sorry. I am so sorry." And Adaeze reached across the table and took her son's hand. Her son who had betrayed her,
who had looked at her with pity when she deserved rage, her son whose first cry had remade her into a mother. She held his hand, and she said, "You are here now." That was all. You are here now. 3 years after that, Chukwuemeka came back. Not to live. That was a different, longer conversation that the family had privately, and that had no simple ending. But he came back to sit with his children, to sit with Adaeze, to say in the way that proud men say things when pride has finally cost them everything they love, that he was sorry, that he had been foolish, that he had allowed a stranger to make him a stranger to his own family. Adaeze listened. She did not fall into his arms. This was not the kind of story, and she had never been that kind of woman. But she listened. She gave him the dignity of being heard. And she said, as she had said to Obiora on that kitchen stool, "You are here now." That was all. You are here now. 3 years after that, Chukwuemeka came back. Not to live. That was a different, longer conversation that the family had privately, and that had no simple ending. But he came back to sit with his children, to sit with Adaeze, to say in the way that proud men say things when pride has finally cost them everything they love, that he was sorry, that he had been foolish, that he had allowed a stranger to make him a stranger to his own family. Adaeze listened. She did not fall into his arms. This was not the kind of story, and she had never been that kind of woman. But she listened. She gave him the dignity of being heard. And she said, as she had said to Obiora on that kitchen stool, "You are here now." That was all. You are here now. The village, watching from its perpetual position of watching, expected a dramatic reunion, expected tears and restoration and a story with a clean bow. They got something quieter and more honest than that. They got a family that had been broken and had chosen slowly and imperfectly to put the pieces back together into a shape that was different from what it had been before, but which held. Chidima grew up to be a lawyer. You will not be surprised by this. The girl with the green notebook, the one who stood up from her father's meeting and kept walking, the one who sat in her mother's kitchen and recorded the truth for 2 years. She grew up to be the kind of lawyer who takes cases that other lawyers find inconvenient, who sits across from powerful people without blinking, who does not, as her father once put it to a friend with a laugh that held more pride than he knew how to express, have any interest in situations where the truth is optional. Nnamdi became a teacher. He went back to Oguta eventually, taught in the secondary school where he had once been a student. His former teachers, watching him grow into a gentle, thoughtful man, would have said that the quiet child had become a quiet man. But those who knew Nnamdi well knew the difference between the old quiet, the quiet of a boy too afraid to choose a side, and the new quiet, which was the quiet of a man who had learned to think before he spoke and to mean it when he finally did. Adaeze herself. What of Adaeze? She stayed in the compound. Her mother had told her, and her grandmother before that a woman does not abandon the ground she has tended, that the compound she had cooked in and planted in and raised children in was hers, not because of any document, but because of the sweat and the years. She stayed. She kept her garden. She kept her kitchen. She grew older in the particular graceful way of women who have been through fire and stopped being afraid of heat. There is something the people of Oguta say about her even now. They say that if you are in trouble, real trouble, the kind that has many layers, the kind where the people you love have turned against you, you should go and sit with Adaeze. Not because she will give you advice. She will not. She will give you tea and she will sit and she will listen in that way she has, that way that makes you feel like the most important thing in the room. And at some point when you have finished talking, she will say something small, something that sounds simple. And 3 weeks later, walking home from market or lying in bed before sleep, It will come back to you, and you will understand suddenly what she meant, and it will be exactly what you needed. This is the thing about Adaeze. And this, in the end, is what Nena had seen from the beginning. Even through all her anger and her plan and her deliberate damage, she had seen it before Chukwuemeka saw it clearly. She had seen it before the son saw it, perhaps even before Adaeze herself understood it fully. That you cannot destroy someone who is rooted. That bitterness and strategy and forged documents and borrowed loyalty, none of it can move a woman who knows who she is and where she stands. The Iroko tree, Nena had said. Even the tallest Iroko must fall eventually. But Adaeze had not fallen. She was still standing. 7 years and then the letter. 7 years of silence and then the voice of a dead woman speaking the truth she had swallowed. 7 years of her sons carrying shame and her daughter carrying purpose, and her husband carrying the weight of the man he had been. And through all of it, through the forgery and the elders' meeting and the packed car and the long silences, Adaeze had remained.
This is not a story about victory exactly. Victory sounds too simple, too clean, too much like a story that belongs to someone else. This is a story about endurance, about the kind of love that does not require witnesses, about a 14-year-old girl who kept writing even when the adults around her were choosing blindness, about a young man who said, "I did not know," and then spent years making sure that not knowing was the last thing he would ever allow himself again. About a woman who opened a letter that held a dead woman's confession, and instead of triumph, felt only the particular sadness of wasted lives, hers, Enena's, Chukwuemeka's, and the particular gratitude of a woman who had, somehow, kept hers from being wasted entirely. There is an old saying that the people of Oguta use, one of those sayings that sound simple until you are old enough to understand it fully. It says, "The truth does not go away. It waits for its moment like the rains." The rains came 7 years later. They came in a letter from a woman who had sat with her dying friend and finally chosen at the end to do the right thing. They came and they washed everything clean. And Adaeze, standing in her kitchen, reading that letter with her son across the table, had felt them come, had felt for the first time in 7 years the particular relief of a woman who had always known the truth and had finally been given the proof. She folded the letter. She looked at her son. She said, "You are here now." And outside, the evening was turning gold, and the tree she had planted when Obiora was born was full and green and old, and the compound smelled of red earth and wood smoke and the specific, irreplaceable smell of home. And Adaeze made tea. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, someone who endured quietly while the world misread them, someone who kept going when they had every reason to stop, then you already know why this channel exists. We tell stories like this because they are real, even when they are old, even when they come dressed in the clothes of folk tale and village compounds and the specific drama of communities that keep each other's business like a second skin. These stories are real because the emotions in them are real. The choices in them are real. The kind of love Adaeze carried is real. The kind of betrayal the sons committed is real. And the kind of return, imperfect, slow, honest, that this family found its way to is the most real thing of all. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because these stories will stay with you long after the screen goes dark.